Story 1.
The massive black Chevrolet Avalanche crunched through the snow, forging its way along the heavily drifted highway that wound through the ancient Oregon forest. The SUV's wipers worked tirelessly throughout the journey, diligently clearing the windshield of the wet snow that spread across it like a murky film. The steering wheel was gripped by powerful hands with broad fingers covered in light, coarse hair. The veins on these hands bulged and paled as their owner suddenly clenched the wheel, as if a predator were seizing the throat of its prey. During sharp turns, a shadowed pinky finger came into view, revealing a dull gleam from a signet ring with a rectangular black stone. For some reason, that rectangular stone in its thin metal setting seemed to perfectly represent its owner. He was a stocky, broad-shouldered man with a strong, determined jaw and a fleshy face. His light hair, already beginning to thin, was cut military short. Bob Dolan, a real estate broker from Philadelphia, had recently turned 50, but despite that, he could proudly say that he was established in life. Indeed, with a stable income of $80,000 a year, a young wife, and a 1-year-old daughter, Bob had every reason to feel content. The company he worked for held a secure position in the market, and even in these uncertain times, Dolan had no need to worry about his family's well-being. At this stage, only one dark cloud loomed over the bright horizon of his life's path. Christmas was approaching, and Bob was miles away from his home state of Texas, stuck in this godforsaken Oregon. Everything had started smoothly. He had timed everything to be at the Dallas airport by the next evening. He rented a car and confidently headed into the state to meet with the department head to deliver important documents from a partnering firm. He'd spent a good sum on the SUV rental, but the company covered all of Bob's travel expenses, so he chose the Avalanche without a second thought. In high spirits, Bob had bought a gray plush bear from Hallmark for his daughter and a pair of Dior earrings for Benita, his wife. He carefully packed the gifts, placed them neatly on the back seat, and throughout the journey, he kept glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure they were still there. Bob was already imagining the joy on his family's faces when they saw the souvenirs. But then, nature decided to intervene. The radio suddenly howled and crackled, cutting off a simple Madonna song mid-verse. Bob shook his head, snapping out of his reverie, nervously glanced at the colorful bags in the back, and cursed as he fiddled with the knob, hoping to catch a signal. A sudden gust of wind threw what seemed like an entire snowdrift onto the windshield. Dolan swore loudly and reached for the wiper controls, intending to turn them to full speed. But at that moment, among the swirling white veil of snow, dangerously close to the SUV, a dark shape flashed by. Startled, Bob slammed the brake and the vehicle spun. Trying to regain control, the man turned the wheel in the opposite direction, but the Avalanche tilted dangerously, and his body felt strangely weightless. The SUV was falling. Barely processing this fact, Bob instinctively wanted to scream in terror, or at least cover his face with his hands, but he was suddenly thrown forward, slamming against the steering wheel. His last thought before his consciousness faded was, "Why didn't the damn airbags deploy?" Bob came to slowly, as if waking from an overly long sleep. His forehead throbbed where it had struck the wheel, and the seatbelt restricted his breathing. Glancing quickly at his large Nautica watch, a gift from Benita, Dolan realized he had been in that position for about half an hour. During that time, the sky had darkened, giving way to the early winter twilight. He needed to get out of there quickly, but first he had to check on the vehicle. Bob opened the door, automatically noting that the blizzard had noticeably subsided, and unbuckled the seatbelt. His body lurched forward again, but this time Dolan was ready, avoiding any new bumps. He clumsily climbed out of the car and immediately found himself knee-deep in snow. Surveying the SUV, Dolan whistled. The vehicle had somehow landed in what appeared to be a roadside ditch, possibly even some sort of drainage channel. But due to its size, it hadn't overturned. It merely had its bumper stuck in the ground and its roof pressed against the snowy slope. Frustrated, Dolan kicked the SUV's tire and cursed. Getting the vehicle out of such a trap alone was impossible, and he had no idea where the nearest semblance of civilization might be. But something had to be done. Twilight was deepening, and unsettling thoughts of spending the night in the middle of an empty highway, dangerously close to the forest, began to creep into his mind. Rumor had it that the Oregon woods were teeming with hungry wolves this time of year. And if not wolves, the cold would certainly do its job, and by morning, Bob could easily end up with pneumonia. Dolan, naturally inclined to pessimism, grew gloomier with each new thought. Climbing up to the highway, he hesitated, walking a few yards in one direction, then the other. Suddenly, a light flickered to his right. Bob perked up, tightened his parka around him, and walked toward it. Not far off, beyond a thick chain of roadside bushes, he saw bright yellow lights, slightly blurred in the evening haze. Bob didn't hesitate for long. There was definitely a building ahead, and what it was didn't matter much to Dolan at the moment. A store, a house, or someone's mansion. The important thing was that there were people there, which meant shelter, warmth, and help. Having made up his mind, Dolan returned to the car, retrieved the gifts that had fallen under the seat, activated the alarm, and headed toward the lights. Suddenly, a sharp sound distracted him. Bob turned around. Emerging from the shadows of the ancient trees was a figure he initially mistook for a wolf. The creature was slinking along the road, and it seemed too large for an ordinary wolf. Bob froze, staring at the dark shape, trying to discern what it was. But as the creature drew closer, he realized it wasn't just a wolf. It was something more, with an elongated snout and eyes glowing in the darkness. Bob felt cold fear grip his mind. Without thinking, he bolted, his feet sinking into the snow, but adrenaline drove him forward. He didn't know what that thing was, but staying here was too dangerous. Finally, Bob broke free of the forest and found himself in front of a massive building, a motel, brightly lit. He felt relief wash over him, realizing he had found a place to take refuge. The motel was impressive in its size and grandeur. Having grown up on a farm in Texas and accustomed to unassuming gray motels during business trips, Bob marveled at the enormous building with its brightly glowing windows. Inside, it was no less remarkable, and Dolan could only wonder how such an elegant place, with luxurious paintings in antique frames and elaborate moldings on high ceilings, had ended up in the middle of the Oregon wilderness. Perhaps it was the whim of some wealthy eccentric. Dolan had read about such things. At some point, money and limitless opportunities can become boring for millionaires, and they start to act out. One would secretly sneak into town disguised as a beggar and wander the streets. So what would stop another from building a luxurious motel in the middle of the Oregon forest and amusing themselves by awaiting the rare travelers who might pass through these parts? A vague sense of unease pricked Bob. He suddenly recalled that the map he had checked a few miles back hadn't shown any turns or this motel. There was nothing there at all except the impenetrable Oregon pine forest. But it was too late to turn back. "How may I help you, sir?" Bob jumped at the voice that came from behind him. A pleasant baritone with a slight rasp and the classic drawl characteristic of the American South. A tall, dark-haired young man in a neat blue uniform stood behind the counter, smiling politely at Dolan. Bob stammered, more from embarrassment than surprise. I'd like a room for the night. My car fell into a ditch and got stuck." The receptionist nodded sympathetically. "Of course, sir. Don't worry about your car. Once the storm clears, we'll get it out." "Great." Bob was relieved. "Do you take credit cards?" "We accept all forms of payment." Dolan was about to ask what other forms of payment there might be besides cards, cash, and electronic transfers, but he stopped himself. The receptionist's expression suggested that there were, in fact, quite a few. The young man took Bob's credit card and pulled out a worn register bound in luxurious black leather with gold embossing. He opened it and handed Bob an elegant pen. Dolan squinted at the register, trying to read the names of the other guests, not out of curiosity, but more out of habit. However, the letters refused to form familiar words, remaining a meaningless jumble of symbols. So he gave up and signed his name, Robert M. Dolan, in bold strokes. The receptionist smiled in satisfaction, returned the credit card, and handed Bob a key with a wooden tag intricately carved with the number 32. "Anything else, Mr. Dolan?" "Yes." Bob nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like something to eat." "Dinner and breakfast are included with the room," the receptionist said, correctly interpreting his hesitation. "I'll have dinner brought to your room in about 10 minutes. "Good." Bob was pleased. "I've been on the road almost all day and I'm starving." "I can imagine," the young man smiled. "Shall I show you to your room?" "No, thank you. I'll find my way. Besides, I have no luggage." Bob smiled in return. "Then you'd better go right to the elevator, take it to the 3rd floor, and your room will be the first door on the left. If you need anything, there's a phone in the room. Just give us a call. By the way, my name's Ted." The motel's corridors were just as impressive as the rest of the place. All the time it took Bob to get to the 3rd floor, he marveled, turning his head, not knowing what to admire more: the soft carpets, the crystal chandeliers, or the paintings, each of which, unlike the usual motel corridor art, was a masterpiece. When he found his room, Dolan eagerly inserted the key into the lock and turned it. Bob was incredibly curious about what his room would look like, given the luxurious decor of the motel. The room, as Bob had vaguely suspected, was somewhat more modestly furnished. Light silk curtains, through which the outline of a similarly thin gauze curtain could be seen, concealed a large window. To the left of it ran a long dresser along the wall, on which stood a television, with a painting hanging above it in a neat frame with intricately carved Rococo-style flourishes. The unknown artist had depicted a fishing schooner battling a fierce storm. The brave crew fought desperately against the sharp wind that tossed the ship from side to side, unaware that in just a few moments, a massive wave would crash down on them from behind. Against the opposite wall was a large bed. Beside it was a small coffee table. On the table was an old, almost antique rotary phone, and next to it lay the TV remote. For some reason, this combination of items from different eras struck Bob as amusing. A little further along was a small folding wardrobe, and on the other side of the bed was a mahogany door, probably leading to the bathroom. The presence of the latter cheered Dolan the most, and after carefully placing the gifts on the bed, he headed toward it when he noticed a folded piece of paper lying a few inches from the door. It was likely slipped through the gap beneath the door or dropped by housekeeping. Intrigued, Bob cautiously picked up the note and unfolded it. It was written on a regular piece of notebook paper, torn hastily by the looks of the jagged edges. The hurried handwriting confirmed this. The letters spilled over the edges of the page, as if the writer had been trying to get the message down as quickly as possible. "I can't take it anymore. They're screaming. They're screaming and begging for help. They're watching me. They're pleading. But I can't do anything. I can't even leave this room. Even now, when I'm already on the other side of the door, I saw that monster outside the window, the damn wolf, it's watching. I'm writing this warning to whoever ends up in this room. Run. Don't stay here. They're screaming. You won't be able to bear it. Run. They're screaming even now. I can hear it even through the locked door. Run. I got lucky. But you might end up there too. Screaming. Begging. Run. Imagine I'm screaming too. Run. I'm begging. Bob stared at the note in horror. What kind of lunatic wrote this? Bob had always considered himself a rational person, one who didn't believe in ghosts and similar nonsense. But there was something eerie about that strange scrap of paper. After reading it, Dolan's hands began to tremble for some reason, but he quickly pulled himself together, forcing his emotions back under control. Cursing, he crumpled the note and tossed it into the room's corner. Deciding that a hot shower had become less of a mere pleasant need and more of a dire necessity, Dolan took off his jacket, grabbed a hanger from the closet, and hung up his parka. He hooked the hanger onto the door handle so the jacket could dry out a bit first. Then, unbuttoning his shirt as he went, he headed for the bathroom. Bob couldn't sleep. He kept turning from side to side, pulling the blanket up to his chin. Sleep just wouldn't come. Neither the hot shower nor the good hearty dinner that the receptionist had brought him helped. His thoughts kept drifting back to the unfortunate accident, then to Benita. He desperately wanted to call her, to hear her sweet, familiar voice, to tell her everything was fine, that he'd be home soon, even if he'd be late for the holiday. However, due to an unfortunate series of events, Benita's number had been blocked by the phone company, forcing him to change his SIM card. He hadn't memorized the new number yet and he'd lost his cell phone. Or maybe he just hadn't noticed when someone snatched it. The new Motorola had a way of attracting attention, including the wrong kind. Shh. Suddenly, a muffled sound broke through Dolan's thoughts. Shh. The sound repeated. Bob sat up sharply, threw off the blanket, and listened. For about a minute, nothing happened. But then, shh, like a wave rolling onto the shore, softly spreading over the pebbles. The source of the noise was somewhere in his room, but Dolan couldn't figure out where. The faucet? He distinctly remembered turning it off, and besides, it couldn't make sounds like that. Shh. By chance, Bob looked up at the painting on the opposite wall and felt a chill run down his spine. The painting had come to life. The ship was gently rocking on the waves which lazily licked the schooner's sides, making the very sound he was hearing. The curtains on the window were drawn, yet the ship was clearly visible, as if illuminated by some unnatural glow. Bob threw off the blanket and was about to jump out of bed to turn on the light when the sound of waves was abruptly replaced by a sharp, "Help us." Dolan immediately recalled the note but quickly dismissed the wild thought. This is just a nightmare. I must be asleep. Or maybe I'm just so exhausted that I'm starting to see things. That happens, right? I know it does. When you've been under too much stress, hallucinations can occur by the end of the day. He realized he was trying to soothe himself with words from one of those trendy magazines Benita subscribed to, filled with absurd articles about psychology and self-control. Dolan had skimmed through it a couple of times and laughed at the ridiculous advice from people who seemed to think they knew better. However, now, thinking of his wife and their distant home, those articles didn't seem so foolish anymore. Slowly, he pulled the blanket back over himself, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead, trying to do it subtly, as if someone might see and mock him for it. Save us, Bob. Hallucinations. Definitely. I'll just pick up the phone and call the receptionist. I'll ask for some port. No, better make it whiskey. There'll be plenty of time before I get back behind the wheel. The alcohol will be out of my system by then, and I'll finally be able to sleep properly." Dolan reached for the phone, only to realize he didn't know the number to dial for the front desk. What was his name again? Tom? Todd? Ted, that's it, Ted. Bob picked up the receiver and pressed it to his ear. A soft, monotonous dial tone confirmed the phone was working. On a whim, Dolan dialed 100. In the dim light of the room, it seemed as if the dial was spinning like the ship's wheel on the schooner. 1, starboard. The captain struggles to change course, but the current fights against him with all its might. 0, please starboard. But the wheel snaps back into place. 0, damn you, starboard. Starboard, I beg you. "Yes, how can I help you?" came a barely discernible voice on the other end. "Good evening. Is this Ted?" Dolan's voice trembled. "This is Bob. Bob from room 32. You remember my car got stuck, and you said it would be pulled out in the morning. Do you remember?" "Oh, Bob." There was a rustling sound, as if the phone had been passed to someone else. "Yes, Bob. I know. Help us, Bob, please. Help us. We're in pain, Bob. We're scared. Bob, you have to help. Kill us, Bob, please. Help yourself, Bob. Help us. Help." Dolan flung the receiver away from him and, this time without hiding it, wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and neck with the edge of the blanket. "What the hell is going on? This is not funny. I'm going downstairs right now to deal with that jokester." But as soon as Bob swung his legs off the bed, he discovered the entire floor was covered in water. Did I really forget to turn off the faucet? Sloshing through the cold water, Bob rushed around the bed and grabbed the bathroom door handle. It was locked. But Dolan didn't remember locking it, and the lock wasn't designed to allow that, in accordance with motel safety regulations. "Shh. Shh. Shh. Save us, Bob. Save us." Another voice joined the first, then a third, and soon a whole chorus was calling out to the terrified Dolan. "Bob, help us. Boob!" Dolan lunged toward the door. This was far beyond mere hallucinations now. Uncontrollable primal fear tore at Bob's mind. He was willing to spend the night in his car or even out in the snow under the pines, but he wasn't going to stay in this room for another second. Suddenly, Bob stopped. The door was gone. In its place was a smooth, seamless wall, from which water was now seeping. "Shh. Bob, hurry. Save us. Save yourself." Dolan's heart pounded at a rate of at least 200 beats per minute. It felt like the water level in the room was rising and the air was growing thinner, and he himself was getting colder and wetter by the second. "Bob." Ignoring the voices, Dolan began making his way toward the window. The window. "I'm only on the 3rd floor. I'll take a breath of fresh air, and this will all go away. Worst case, I'll just jump. I'll hang from the ledge first. I'm 6 feet tall, then drop down." Dolan shoved aside the floating coffee table and grabbed the curtains. They wouldn't budge, so he yanked them down. The curtain rod struck Bob's shoulder, but he didn't even notice. It had revealed his path to escape. He rushed to the window and nearly screamed. Outside, there was only darkness, occasionally lit by faint flashes of lightning. But in that darkness was something terrifying, something wild and cruel. Against the pitch-black sky, Bob saw a huge werewolf, standing still and staring directly at him. Its eyes glowed in the dark like twin fires, and it remained as motionless as a statue. But Dolan knew this creature was alive, and it was waiting. The werewolf seemed to be waiting for Bob to attempt his escape so it could strike. Paralyzed with fear, the man slammed the curtains shut and stumbled back, gasping for breath. He noticed a note floating beside him. Bob picked it up and unfolded it. The ink had smudged slightly, but the words were still legible. "Bob, save us. We're scared, Bob. You can still save yourself. The last one managed to, but he didn't save us, so we're still here with him. Bob, you won't be able to run. His guardian, his hound, the werewolf won't let the prey escape. He's outside, and you're inside." Without finishing the note, Dolan threw it aside and began making his way toward the painting. It was difficult, as the water level had risen to his waist, and the room was now cluttered with objects Bob hadn't expected to see there. Bottles, barrels, fragments of nets, and swollen, rotting pieces of wood floated around. Reaching the painting, he tore it from the wall and screamed at the depicted schooner. "What the hell? What's going on? Where am I? I'm not asleep. How do I get out of here?" The waves continued crashing against the tiny ship. "Help, Bob. He's toying with us. It amuses him. Help, Bob." "Who is he? My God, who is he?" Dolan was losing control, shaking the painting like a madman and shouting at the top of his lungs. "The motel, Bob, it's alive. It's a mind in the stone, and it's bored. It's bored, and we're in pain, Bob. Help." "What kind of crap are you spewing? What motel? Who are you?" "We're its visitors. We're the guests of room 32. He doesn't seem to touch anyone else. He only toys with the guests of this room. Help, Bob." "How many of you?" "There are 10 of us. You'll be the 12th if you don't help us. Bob, save us all. Save yourself. Bob, think of Benita. Remember Amanda, Bob." "Shut up. Do you hear me? Shut up. How do you even know about my family? How do you know anything? What the hell is this? Surely the police would have noticed people going missing. And why would I be the 12th? Dolan's voice was hoarse, and he could only rasp now. But he didn't lower his volume, gripping the frame of the painting until his knuckles turned white. "Bob, there is no police here. There's only what he wants. I'm Sam. In 1993, I stopped on the outskirts of Detroit because my Cadillac ran out of gas. And standing next to me is Michael, 30 years before me in Westphalia. He decided to throw a party to celebrate his divorce and booked a room. Bob, there's no police here. There never will be. We were the first captives, Bob. I don't know how much time has passed, but then Tahachi joined us. After a long voyage, he decided to stop in Beijing. In 1963, Bob. Do you understand, Bob? What kind of police? Half of us don't even know what that word means, Bob. But he knows everything about us. You hear me, Bob? Everything. And since we're now part of him, we know too. The only secret kept from us is how to get free. But you can help us, Bob. Kill us. Kill us, Bob. He'll get bored and he'll let you go, Bob. We know. He didn't let the last one go because he had the chance, but he didn't take it. But you can. Dolan screamed and flung the painting away, then rushed to the door. It still wasn't there. Or rather, he just couldn't see it. But it had to be there. It had to be there. Had to be. Would be. Bob was startled to realize he was beginning to get his words mixed up. With a scream, he threw himself at the spot where he believed the door should be. The storm outside grew fiercer, the waves stronger, and that meant time was running out. For some reason, Dolan knew that if he didn't make it before the giant wave engulfed the schooner, nothing would save him. Glass shattered outside, and the water level in the room had already risen to his chest. Save us, fool. You can't escape him. Blur. Blur. Bob tried to yell at the voices to shut up, but all that came out were strange, gurgling sounds. Terrified even more, he began pounding on the wall with his fists, trying to break through with his shoulder. But the wall only responded with a dull, displeased thud, and the droplets seeping from it grew larger. Meanwhile, the giant wave loomed ever closer. Bob, save us. Suddenly, Dolan's heart, which had always been healthy, couldn't take the strain. He slowly slid down the wall, his trembling hand still reaching out toward the polished door handle that no longer existed. "I can't say for certain, but it appears to be a heart attack," said a young man, about 26 years old, wearing a long coat over his medical uniform. "Strange," muttered the man standing next to him, dressed in a highway patrol officer's uniform. "I'd understand if he had died from exposure. In some cases, a heart attack can be triggered by stress, especially under critical conditions," the young man responded. "But what I don't understand is why he left the car. It's practically undamaged. Yet he went into the woods with gifts and this note." The young man held up a folded piece of notebook paper. Written on it in broad, hurried strokes were the words, "You have no idea how lucky you are." "Yeah." The inspector scratched his head. Maybe he was looking for something or someone. The medic sighed. "I'm afraid we'll never know. Let's get the body into the vehicle. And don't forget the gifts. His family should have at least some reminder that he was thinking of them until the very last moment of his life."
Story 2.
I write this letter with trembling hands, my nerves frayed. The pen in my grip feels heavy, almost foreign, as if I'm not just writing but etching my very soul onto these pages. I can't believe what I'm about to tell you is real. Maybe I'm crazy. But when they tried to diagnose me, all they did was shake their heads, advising me to stop talking nonsense and try to cope with my violent fantasy. It all started 6 months ago, a time when life seemed simple, my days filled with the mundane yet comforting routine of a high school senior. I was studying hard for the SAT. The pages of my textbooks often blurred into a dance of numbers and words as I pushed myself into the late hours of the night. The silence of my room, punctuated only by the soft ticking of the clock and the occasional turn of a page, was a sanctuary of sorts. My participation in extracurricular and social activities was not just a pursuit of interest, but a meticulously planned strategy. Sports, volunteer work, school clubs, you name it, I was there. Each activity was a carefully placed piece in the puzzle of my resume, all for one single goal: to get accepted by a prestigious university. Life was good, in a predictable, comfortable way. I had a happy family. My parents, always supportive, often worried about me overworking myself, but proud nonetheless. My younger sister, with her endless chatter about school dramas, provided a much-needed distraction from my own stress. And then there was my small group of friends, a tight-knit circle who valued my opinions and showed genuine love and support. We were a band of dreamers, each chasing our own version of the future. It was a time of ambition, a time when my peers and I were desperately trying to make up for lost time in everything. Be it studies or a failed romance, there was a palpable sense of urgency in the air, a collective scramble to seize every opportunity, to right every wrong. The school year was in full swing, a routine of classes, homework, and the occasional high school drama firmly established when she arrived. Her name was Isabella, and from the moment she stepped into the school, she was unlike anyone we had ever seen. Isabella had an air about her that was at once captivating and disconcerting. She was undeniably beautiful, with long, dark brown hair that fell in light waves around her shoulders, framing her face in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if each strand was carefully placed to enhance her mysterious allure. When she moved, her hair caught the light, shimmering with fires of hues, like sunlight dancing on a calm sea. Her eyes were large and honey-colored, framed by thick black lashes that gave her gaze a depth that was hard to decipher. It was as if her eyes held secrets, stories untold that beckoned you closer, even as they warned you to keep your distance. Her skin was olive-toned, glowing with a golden hue under the rays of the sun, and her lips were lush and red, often curved in a knowing smile that hinted at an inner amusement. Her style of dress was as distinctive as her appearance. She always dressed brightly, favoring colors that seemed to enhance her natural radiance. Wherever she went, she attracted attention, turning heads and drawing whispers. I remember the day she first walked into our classroom. The sun was streaming through the windows, casting patterns of light and shadow across the desks. The teacher introduced her as Isabella, and as she looked around the room, her gaze lingered on each of us for a moment, as if committing our faces to memory. I liked her immediately, though I couldn't have explained why. One day I walked past her locker and saw her opening it. The way she did it was oddly fascinating, deliberate and graceful, as if even this simple act was part of a larger, unseen dance. She noticed me watching her and smiled. As the weeks passed, I couldn't help but notice that among all my friends, it was me who seemed to hold Isabella's attention the most. She often sought me out, her honey-colored eyes lingering on me during our conversations. Despite this, we never progressed beyond the bounds of friendly chats. My commitment to Nancy, my girlfriend, was a line I wasn't willing to cross. Nancy, with her easy smile and no-nonsense attitude, had been a steady presence in my life for over a year. Our relationship was comfortable, familiar. A month into Isabella's arrival, the initial buzz that surrounded her began to fade. The novelty of the new mysterious girl wore off, and she gradually became just another student in the crowded hallways of our school. Still, her beauty and aura of mystery kept her at the center of attention, particularly among the boys. I watched as various guys tried their luck, approaching Isabella with clumsy attempts at charm. They offered her gifts, flowers, chocolates, even a few love letters that looked more like essays. But Isabella turned them all down, her rejections polite yet firm. It seemed she wasn't interested in dating, or perhaps she hadn't found anyone who caught her interest. Instead, Isabella threw herself into her studies with a fervor that was almost alarming. I would often see her in the library, her head buried in books that ranged from classic literature to advanced physics. She had a hunger for knowledge that was insatiable, devouring information with an intensity that was both impressive and slightly unnerving. As days turned into weeks, I began to notice a shift in Isabella's behavior towards me. She had a way of sitting close enough that I could catch the subtle scent of her perfume, a faint aroma that reminded me of old books and autumn leaves. In class, her presence became more pronounced, her gaze often resting on me for longer than was comfortable. I caught her several times sketching in her notebook, and one day, driven by curiosity, I managed to glance at her drawings. To my surprise, I found myself staring back from the pages. It was flattering and unsettling in equal measure. I wasn't exactly a stranger to attention. Without sounding conceited, I was well known in school. A combination of decent academic performance, a spot on the varsity football team, and a generally sociable demeanor made me fairly popular. My appearance, which I'd always taken a casual pride in, now seemed to serve as a point of fascination for Isabella. But as I sit here, scribbling down these memories, that version of me seems like a distant echo. The reflection that stares back at me now from the mirror is a shadow of that former self. Dark circles under hollow eyes, a gaunt face, and hands that tremble with an unrelenting mix of fear and malnutrition. But let's return to the story, to those days that now seem so innocuously serene in hindsight. Isabella's interest in me was a topic of mild amusement among my friends. They'd nudge me with knowing looks, teasingly suggesting there was more to her attention than mere artistic appreciation. Nancy, on the other hand, didn't find it amusing. Her smiles became less frequent, replaced by a tight-lipped concern. Our conversations often circled back to Isabella. Nancy's words tinged with an edge of jealousy and worry. The day I saw Isabella painting my face with such vigor, I felt curious. Her focus on the sketch was so fervent it seemed as if she was trying to capture something more than just my physical likeness. After class, driven by a blend of curiosity and vanity, I approached her. She looked up, her honey-colored eyes meeting mine, and with a gentle smile, she carefully tore out the sheet of paper and handed it to me. I expected her to wait, to watch my reaction, but she simply gathered her things and left the class, her steps light and graceful. Holding the drawing, I was struck by the meticulous detail. It was more than a mere sketch. It was as if a part of me had been transferred onto the paper. Every line, every contour of my face was captured with an almost eerie precision. It was beautiful and unsettling in equal measure. Later that day, I saw her again, standing by the school gates. She appeared to be waiting for something, or someone. As our eyes met, there was an unspoken acknowledgement, a connection that went beyond words. I walked over, the drawing still in my hand. "Thank you, Isabella. I really enjoyed it," I said, trying to convey my appreciation. Her smile widened, a glint of something unidentifiable in her eyes. "Shall we go for a walk together?" she asked, her voice tinged with hopeful anticipation. We spent the next half hour wandering the streets near the school. The conversation was surprisingly easy, Isabella speaking with a fluidity that was captivating. She told me about the places she had lived before moving here, painting vivid pictures of distant towns and cities. She spoke of her relatives in a detached manner, mentioning them more as characters in a story rather than people she was connected to. As we were about to part ways, she turned to me with a question that took me by surprise. "Can I paint you on a good canvas?" Her voice was earnest, her gaze intense. The proposal was unexpected, but I found myself agreeing without much hesitation. The idea of being immortalized in a painting by someone as talented as Isabella was flattering, and I was curious to see how she would translate my likeness into a larger, more permanent medium. The following days were marked by a sense of anticipation. I found myself distracted, my thoughts often drifting to Isabella and the upcoming portrait session. Nancy noticed the change in me, her expressions fluctuating between concern and annoyance. Our conversations grew more strained, the unspoken tension between us thickening like fog. When the day finally came for Isabella to paint my portrait, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. She had asked me to meet her at her house, a quaint old building that stood at the edge of town. The house had an air of neglect about it, the paint peeling in places, the garden overgrown. But there was a charm to it, a sense of history that was almost palpable. Isabella greeted me at the door, her smile warm yet enigmatic. She led me to a room that she had converted into a studio. The space was filled with canvases, some blank, some adorned with hauntingly beautiful paintings. The light filtered in through the dusty windows, casting a soft glow on the array of brushes and paints that lay neatly arranged on a table. Isabella's demeanor as she painted was focused, almost trance-like. When she finally stepped back, signaling that the session was over, I felt a rush of relief. I was eager to see the painting, to see how she had captured me, but Isabella covered it with a cloth before I could get a glimpse. "It's not ready yet," she said, her voice distant. "You'll see it when it's finished." I must confess, there was an undeniable pull towards Isabella, a gravitational force that seemed to draw me into her orbit with each passing day. We continued to spend time together after school, our conversations meandering through a myriad of topics, from the mundane to the profound. There was an ease in our interactions, a comfort in the way our thoughts and words intertwined. However, there was Nancy. She had been a constant in my life, a grounding presence amidst the whirlwinds of teenage drama. But as my connection with Isabella deepened, so too did the rift between Nancy and me. The day she confronted me about my time with Isabella was inevitable. I remember it vividly. The accusation in her eyes, the quiver in her voice that spoke of hurt and betrayal. Nancy's reaction was explosive, a mixture of anger, jealousy, and tears. Despite my assurances that Isabella and I were just friends, she saw through the thin veil of my half-truths. Deep down, I knew Nancy was right. My feelings for Isabella had transcended the bounds of mere friendship. It was my fault that things had come to this point. I could have set clear boundaries with Isabella from the start, could have maintained a respectful distance, but the truth was I didn't want to. Confronted with Nancy's ultimatum, I was torn. Part of me rebelled at the idea of cutting Isabella out of my life, yet I couldn't bear the thought of losing Nancy. After a long, sleepless night wrestling with my conscience, I made a decision. I would do as Nancy asked, as I had promised. I would stop all communication with Isabella. The following day was heavy with unspoken words and lingering glances. When I saw Isabella, her eyes searched mine, a question unasked, yet clearly understood. I avoided her, each step away from her feeling like a betrayal of what I truly wanted. But I had made a promise to Nancy, and I intended to keep it. The day I noticed Isabella's gaze had changed, transformed from curiosity and affection into something colder, more resentful, it unsettled me. Her eyes, once warm and inviting, now seemed to bore into me with a sharpness that felt almost tangible. I hadn't expected to confront her after school, but as fate would have it, our paths crossed. The schoolyard was nearly empty, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the concrete. As I approached her, I could feel the weight of the moment, the inevitable confrontation that loomed between us. "I thought you liked me," Isabella said, her voice tinged with a hurt that seemed to go deeper than mere disappointment. "That something was possible between us. Why did you give me hope?" Her words struck a chord in me, guilt and confusion intertwining in a tight knot. Before I could respond, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried an intensity I had never heard from her before. "I want to say something. I love you. Be with me, or else I will. Make it so." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. It sounded like a threat, veiled but unmistakable. At the time, I didn't take it seriously, but a part of me was unnerved by the intensity in her eyes. In a mix of annoyance and bewilderment, I replied, "I didn't mean to give you any reason. I was just talking to you as a friend. You knew I had a sweetheart, my Nancy. If you thought I gave you an excuse, I'm sorry. It wasn't like that." Confusion reigned in my mind. I had never been in such a contradictory situation before. My words, meant to be conciliatory, seemed to have the opposite effect. I watched as Isabella's face contorted with anger and hatred, her features momentarily twisting into something vile and repulsive. A shiver of horror ran down my spine at the sight. With a soft, almost sinister smirk, she said, "You'll be sorry," and then turned, walking away with a grace that belied the malice in her words. I stood there, frozen, as the chill of the evening air began to seep into my bones. Walking home, I replayed the conversation in my head, each word echoing with a foreboding I couldn't shake. The image of Isabella's distorted face haunted me, a glimpse into a side of her I hadn't known existed. The streets were quiet, the rhythmic sound of my footsteps a lonely accompaniment to my troubled thoughts. Arriving home, I found no relief. The house was empty, my parents still at work, and the silence felt oppressive. I went to the kitchen, mechanically preparing a sandwich, but my appetite was gone. The food tasted like ash in my mouth. By the time evening rolled around, the events of the day with Isabella had receded to the back of my mind, leaving only a lingering bitterness. Wrapped comfortably in my blanket, I was on the cusp of sleep when a peculiar sound shattered the silence. A scratching, a persistent clawing was coming from the wall outside my bedroom window. The sound grew in intensity, morphing into a desperate scrabbling that sent shivers down my spine. In a sudden rush of fear, I bolted from my bed, my heart pounding in my ears. The hallway seemed longer than usual as I sprinted towards the safety of my parents' room. I burst in, panting, to find my mom reading at the table while my dad was just dozing off. Their surprised faces turned to amusement as I blurted out my story. They laughed, a light-hearted chuckle that stung me more than I cared to admit. "You're such an adult, yet scared like a little kid," my mom teased. I could see they didn't believe me, brushing it off as an overactive imagination. Offended and frustrated, I left their room, my mind racing with unanswered questions and rising panic. What was I to do? Returning to my room was out of the question. The scratching sound still echoed in my mind, too real to be dismissed as mere fancy. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed my phone and dialed Nancy's number, seeking comfort and understanding. When Nancy answered, her voice was a balm to my frazzled nerves. I recounted my experience, expecting skepticism but hoping for support. To my surprise, she didn't laugh or dismiss my fears. Instead, there was a gravity in her tone that I had never heard before. She confessed that she had experienced something similar, a revelation that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. We agreed to meet at the vacant lot not far from my house, a neutral ground away from prying eyes and unsettling noises. Hurriedly, I dressed, my movements erratic, fueled by adrenaline and fear. I told my parents I was going for a walk with Nancy. Their response, a playful jibe about my being a little coward, did nothing to ease my apprehension. "Don't stay out too long," my dad called out as I hurried out the door, his words tinged with paternal concern beneath the teasing. The night was darker than usual, the moon obscured by thick clouds, casting the world in murky shadows. The vacant lot was a 5-minute walk from my house, but tonight it felt like an eternity. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the branches set my nerves on edge. The cold wind bit into my skin as I raced towards the vacant lot, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The night was oppressively dark. My heart pounded in my chest, a relentless drum echoing my fear. What I saw upon arriving at the lot froze me in my tracks, a scene straight out of a nightmare. Nancy lay on the ground, her body a broken, bleeding mess. Hovering over her was a creature, a grotesque parody of a dog. It was large, rat-like, with matted, frizzy hair that seemed to drip with some unidentifiable liquid. Its sharp teeth tore mercilessly at Nancy's face, ripping off her cheek with a sickening diligence. For a few agonizing moments I was paralyzed, horror rooting me to the spot. The scene before me was too gruesome, too surreal to process. Then my stomach revolted, a violent surge of nausea overwhelming me. I vomited uncontrollably, my body convulsed. As I fell to my knees, weak and trembling, the creature's red eyes snapped towards me. It was a gaze filled with malice, a malevolent intelligence that sent a chill slicing through my already frigid body. In that instant, I knew I had to act, to defend myself. With a desperate scramble, I grabbed a rock from the ground, its rough surface biting into my palm. I hurled it at the beast with all the strength I could muster. The creature, with an agility that belied its grotesque form, dodged the projectile easily. It snarled, a sound that was guttural and chilling, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Panic took over, and I turned to run, but my foot caught on something unseen in the darkness. I stumbled, falling hard onto the unforgiving ground. Pain exploded in my head as it struck the earth, stars dancing before my eyes. I tried to rise, but a searing agony in my leg stopped me. The creature was upon me, its teeth sunk deep into my flesh. The pain was blinding, a white-hot intensity that obliterated all other sensations. I could feel the warm blood gushing from the wound, the creature's breath hot and foul against my skin. My screams tore through the night, a desperate plea for help that I knew would go unanswered. The last vestiges of consciousness slipped away from me, the world fading to black as the creature's jaws tightened their grip. I awoke to a world of sterile white, the sharp, antiseptic smell of the hospital stinging my nostrils. My legs were swathed in bandages, a dull, throbbing pain pulsating through them. Above me, the ceiling tiles blurred into focus, each one a stark reminder of the grim reality I now faced. My mother was there, her chair pulled close to my bed. Her hand was clasped around mine, a lifeline in this sea of uncertainty. Her eyes, red-rimmed and weary, lit up with a mixture of relief and exhaustion when she saw me stir. "Son, finally," she said, her voice a whisper of hope. "Everyone already thought it would end badly for you. Are you feeling okay?" Her words triggered a flood of memories, a torrent of horror that crashed over me with unrelenting force. The image of the creature, that monstrous parody of a dog, feasting on Nancy, flashed in my mind. I let out a strangled cry, the sound of despair incarnate. "What happened? Is Nancy all right? Tell me I dreamed the whole thing?" My mother's face crumpled, her eyes lowering as she delivered the words that shattered my world. "Nancy is gone," she murmured. "She was attacked by some predatory animal. That's what the police said. They found you covered in blood, with bitten feet, but most importantly alive." The room seemed to spin, a carousel of pain and disbelief. I felt a piercing headache, the pain a physical manifestation of the horror that gripped my soul. In a voice barely above a whisper, I said, "Mom, I saw everything. It was a dog, but it was unusual, like it was intelligent. You know." Her look, one of pity and disbelief, stung me. It was the gaze one gives to someone who has lost touch with reality, a look that labeled me as delusional. This infuriated me, the frustration and fear boiling over into rage. "I'm telling the truth," I yelled. "Why won't anyone believe me?" At my outburst, a nurse hurried into the room, her face a mask of professional concern. She quickly assessed the situation, her movements practiced and efficient. I barely felt the prick of the needle as she administered the sedative, my consciousness already teetering on the edge. As the drug coursed through my veins, dulling the pain and pulling me down into a murky haze, I caught snippets of the nurse's conversation with my mother. "He's delirious," she said in a soothing tone. "It will pass." Those words echoed in my mind as I drifted off, a mantra of dismissal that sought to negate the horror I had witnessed. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I had seen, what I had experienced, was no delusion. The creature, that nightmarish beast, was real. In the deep embrace of night, I awoke to a world shrouded in darkness. The hospital room, illuminated only by the faint glow of the hallway light seeping under the door, felt claustrophobic, a cage of shadows. My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through my veins as my eyes adjusted to the dim light. There, in the darkness, two red eyes glowed ominously. My breath caught in my throat, terror gripping me with icy fingers. Then, a quiet voice broke the silence, a voice that sent shivers down my spine. "It's me, Isabella." Her words were a cold whisper, a chilling wind that swept through the room. "I told you that you would regret it, but I'm going to give you another chance. Be with me, and your family will not be harmed. What's your answer to that?" I lay there frozen in fear, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a side effect of the medication. But the red glow of her eyes, the palpable sense of menace that filled the room, it was all too real. "Who are you? What kind of monster are you?" I managed to stammer, my voice trembling with dread. Isabella moved closer, her hand covering my mouth with an unnerving gentleness. "We are called Nagual," she whispered. "We are a race of humans, mages, shamans, werewolves. But no one will believe you." Her words hung in the air, a declaration of a reality too bizarre, too frightening to comprehend. My mind struggled to process the information, to make sense of the impossible. "I'm going to leave now, and you think whether your family is dear to you." "Think well," she said, her tone a mix of warning and enticement. As her hand stroked my face, a gesture that should have been comforting but was anything but, I felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Then, as silently as she had appeared, Isabella left the room, melting into the shadows like a ghost. I lay there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to convince myself that it had been a dream, a figment of my imagination. But the cold touch of her hand on my face, the lingering sense of her presence, it was all too real. The room felt oppressive, the darkness a tangible presence that seemed to press down on me. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but fear held my voice captive. What could I say? Who would believe such an outlandish story? Nagual, the word echoed in my mind, a term from folklore and legend, now given terrifying substance. Mages, shamans, werewolves. The words were like pieces of a puzzle, falling into place to form a picture that was as fascinating as it was horrifying. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and fears. The night seemed endless, a void in which time had ceased to exist. Every creak of the hospital, every rustle of the sheets, sent my heart racing, a constant reminder of the nightmare that had become my reality. The night stretched on endlessly, a tapestry of shadows and fears. Each creak and murmur of the hospital seemed to whisper Isabella's name, a relentless reminder of the terror that had infiltrated my life. Sleep was an elusive dream, its absence leaving me in a state of heightened anxiety, expecting at any moment to see those red eyes emerge from the darkness. As afternoon dawned, bringing with it the mundane rhythms of hospital life, my resolve hardened. I had to tell someone, to share the unbelievable truth of what I had witnessed. The doctor, a middle-aged man with kind blue eyes and a reassuring demeanor, seemed like my best chance. But as I poured out my story, his expression shifted from concern to something akin to detached professionalism. My heart sank as he called in a psychiatrist. Their disbelief was a tangible thing, a wall of skepticism that I could not penetrate. They subjected me to a battery of tests, probing and questioning, but their conclusions were clear. I was adequate, my experiences dismissed as the desperate attempts of a traumatized mind to make sense of tragedy. The psychiatrist, with his practiced calm and analytical gaze, suggested that I was trying to rationalize the horrific events that had befallen Nancy and me. He spoke of grief, of shock, of the mind's ability to conjure fantastical explanations for the inexplicable. But his words felt like hollow echoes, meaningless in the face of the reality I had experienced. I was left alone, my story unbelieved, my fears unacknowledged. The sense of isolation was crushing, a weight that pressed down on me with every passing hour. In this sterile, indifferent environment, I felt like a ghost, unseen and unheard. As the day waned, a desperate plan began to form in my mind. I wouldn't let Isabella win, to bring harm to my family. I couldn't stand by and watch as my life and the lives of those I loved were destroyed by this malevolent force. In a moment of reckless determination, I managed to steal a bottle of strong tranquilizers from the nurse's station. My hands trembled as I clutched the small vial, the pills inside a promise of escape, of an end to the nightmare. I sat there, on the edge of my hospital bed, the bottle in my hand. My thoughts were a chaotic swirl of fear, love, and resolve. Nancy's face floated in my mind, her smile a bittersweet memory that pierced my heart. I clung to the image of her, a beacon in the dark sea of my despair. With a shaky breath, I unscrewed the cap of the bottle. The pills lay there, innocuous yet deadly. This was it, my final act, a sacrifice to protect those I cared for. My death would be a shield, a barrier against the darkness that threatened to consume us all. I penned this note, a final testament to the truth of my experiences. To whoever reads this, I implore you to believe me, to heed my warning. Be vigilant, be cautious, for the world is not as it seems. There are shadows that lurk in the corners of reality, dangers that defy explanation. To my family, I leave my love, a love that transcends the boundaries of life and death. Know that I did this to protect you, to keep you safe from the horrors that stalked my every waking moment. And to Isabella, if by some cruel twist of fate you ever read these words, know that my final thoughts were of defiance. You may have claimed my life, but you will never claim my spirit. Burn in hell.